Section 18 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Eminent Orators. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Little Journeys to the Homes of Eminent Orators by Elbert Hubbard. Henry Ward Beecher, Part 1. You know how the heart is subject to freshets. You know how the mother, always loving her child, yet seeing in it some new wile of affection, will catch it up and cover it with kisses and break forth in a rapture of loving. Such a kind of heart-glow fell from the Saviour upon that young man who said to him, "Good Master, what good thing shall I do that I may inherit eternal life?" It is said, then Jesus, beholding him, loved him. Henry Ward Beecher. The influence of Henry Ward Beecher upon his time was marked, and now the stream of his life is lost amid the ocean of our being. As a single drop of aniline in a barrel of water will tint the whole mass, so has the entire American mind been colored through the existence of this one glowing personality. He placed a new interpretation on religion, and we are different people because he lived. He was not constructive, not administrative. He wrote much, but as literature his work has small claim on immortality. He was an orator, and the business of the orator is to inspire other men to think and act for themselves. Orators live but in memory. Their destiny is to be the sweet, elusive fragrance of oblivion, the time and mignonette of things that were. The limitations in the all-around man are byproducts which are used by destiny in the making of orators. The welling emotions, the vivid imagination, the forgetfulness of self, the abandon to feeling. All these things in Wall Street are spurious coin. No prudent man was ever an orator, no cautious man ever made a multitude change its mind, when it had vowed it would not. Oratory is indiscretion set to music. The great orator is great on account of his weaknesses as well as on account of his strength. So why should we expect the orator to be the impeccable man of perfect parts? These essays attempt to give the man. They are neither a vindication nor an apology. Edmund Gosse has recently said something so wise and to the point on the subject of biography that I cannot resist the temptation to quote him. Quote, "If the reader will but bear with me so far as to endure the thesis that the first theoretical object of the biographer should be indiscretion, not discretion, I will concede almost everything practical to delicacy. But this must be granted to me, that the aim of all portraiture ought to be the emphasizing of what makes the man different from, not like, other men. The widow almost always desires that her deceased hero should be represented as exactly like all other respectable men, only a little grander, a little more glorified. She hates, as only a bad biographer can hate, the telling of the truth with respect to those faults and foibles which made the light and shade of his character. This, it appears, was the primitive view of biography. The mass of medieval memorials was of the expanded tract order. It was mainly composed of lives of the saints, tractates in which the possible and the impossible were mingled in inextricable disorder, but where every word was intended directly for edification. Here the biographer was a moralist whose hold upon exact truth of statement was very loose indeed, but who was determined that every word he wrote should strengthen his readers in the faith. Nor is this generation of biographers dead today. Half the lives of the great and good men which are published in England and America are expanded tracts. Let the biographer be tactful, but do not let him be cowardly. Let him cultivate delicacy, but avoid its ridiculous parody, prudery." End quote. And I also quote this from James Anthony Froude. Quote, "The usual custom in biography is to begin with the brightest side and to leave the faults to be discovered afterwards. It is dishonest and it does not answer. Of all literary sins, Carlyle himself detested most a false biography. Faults, frankly acknowledged, are frankly forgiven. Faults concealed work always like poison. Burns's offenses were made no secret of. They are now forgotten, and Burns stands without a shadow on him, the idol of his countrymen. Byron's diary was destroyed, and he remains and will remain with a stain of suspicion about him, which revives and will never be wholly obliterated. The truth shall make you free in biography as in everything else. Falsehood and concealment are a great man's worst enemy." End quote. Henry Ward Beecher was born at Litchfield, Connecticut, June 23, 1813. He was the 8th child of Lyman and Roxana Foote Beecher. Like Lincoln and various other great men, Beecher had two mothers, the one who gave him birth and the one who cared for him as he grew up. Beecher used to take with him on his travels an old daguerreotype of his real mother, and in the cover of the case beneath the glass was a lock of her hair, fair in color and bright as if touched by the kiss of the summer sun. Often he would take this picture out and apostrophize it, just as he would the uncut gems that he always carried in his pockets. My first mother, he used to call her, and to him she stood as a sort of deity. My first mother stands to me for love, my second mother for discipline, my father for justice, he once said to Halliday. I am not sure that Beecher had a well-defined idea of either discipline or justice, but love to him was a very vivid and personal reality. He knew what it meant, infinite forgiveness, a lifelong, yearning tenderness, a something that suffereth long and is kind. This he preached for 50 years, and he preached little else. Lyman Beecher proclaimed the justice of God. Henry Ward Beecher told of his love. Lyman Beecher was a logician, but Henry Ward was a lover. There is a task on hand for the man who attempts to prove that nature is kind or that God is love. Perhaps man himself, with all his imperfections, gives us the best example of love that the universe has to offer. In preaching the love of God, Henry Ward Beecher revealed his own, for oratory, like literature, is only a confession. My first mother is always pleading for me. She reaches out her arms to me. Her delicate, long, tapering fingers stroke my hair. I hear her voice gentle and low. Do you say this is the language of overwrought emotion? I say to you it is simply the language of love. This mother, dead and turned to dust, who passed out when the boy was scarce 3 years old, stood to him for the ideal. Love, anyway, is a matter of the imagination, and he who cannot imagine cannot love, and love is from within. The lover clothes the beloved in the garments of his fancy, and woe to him if he ever loses the power to imagine. Have you not often noticed how the man or woman whose mother died before a time that the child could recall, and whose memory clusters around a faded picture and a lock of hair, how this person is thrice blessed in that the ideal is always a shelter when the real palls? Love is a refuge and a defense. The law of compensation is kind. Lincoln lived until the day of his death bathed in the love of Nancy Hanks, that mother, worn, yellow, and sad, who gave him birth and yet whom he had never known. No child ever really lost its mother. Nothing is ever lost. Men are really only grown-up children, and the longing to be mothered is not effaced by the passing years. The type is well shown in the life of Meissonier, whose mother died in his childhood, but she was near him to the last. In his journal he wrote this: "It is the morning of my 70th birthday. What a long time to look back upon. This morning at the hour my mother gave me birth, I wished my first thoughts to be of her. Dear mother, how often have the tears risen at the remembrance of you. It was your absence, my longing for you, that made you so dear to me. The love of my heart goes out to you. Do you hear me, mother, crying and calling for you? How sweet it must be to have a mother." One might suppose that a childless woman suddenly presented by fate with an exacting husband and a brood of 9 would soon be a candidate for nervous prostration. Sarah Porter Beecher, however, rose to the level of events and looked after her household with diligence and a conscientious heart. Little Henry Ward was 4 years old and wore a red flannel dress outgrown by one of the girls. He was chubby with a full moon face and yellow curls, which were so much trouble to take care of that they were soon cut off, after he had set the example of cutting off 2 himself. He talked as though his mouth were full of hot mush. If sent to a neighbor's on an errand, he usually forgot what he was sent for, or else explained matters in such a way that he brought back the wrong thing. His mother meant to be kind. Her patience was splendid, and one's heart goes out to her in sympathy when we think of her faithful efforts to teach the lesser catechism to this baby savage, who much preferred to make mud pies. Little Henry Ward had a third mother who did him much gentle benefit, and that was his sister Harriet, 2 years his senior. These little child mothers who take care of the younger members of the family deserve special seats in paradise. Harriet taught little Henry Ward to talk plainly, to add 4 and 4, and to look solemn when he did not feel so, and thus escape the strap behind the kitchen door. His bringing up was of the uncaressing, let alone kind. Lyman Beecher was a deal better than his religion, for his religion, like that of most people, was an inheritance, not an evolution. Piety settled down upon the household like a pall every Saturday at sundown, and the lessons taught were largely from the Old Testament. These big, bustling, strenuous households are pretty good life drill for the members. The The children are taught self-reliance, to do without each other, to do for others, and the older members educate the younger ones. It is a great thing to leave children alone. Henry Ward Beecher has intimated in various places in his books how the whole Beecher brood loved their father, yet as precaution against misunderstanding, they made the sudden sneak and the quick sidestep whenever they saw him coming. Village life, with a fair degree of prosperity, but not too much as an education in itself. The knowledge gained is not always classic, nor even polite, but it is all a part of the great, seething game of life. Henry Ward Beecher was not an educated man in the usual sense of the word. At school he carved his desk, made faces at the girls, and kept the place in a turmoil, generally doing the wrong thing, just like many another bumpkin. At home he carried in the wood, picked up chips, worked in the garden in summer, and shoveled out the walks in winter. He knew when the dishwater was worth saving to mix up with meal for the chickens, and when it should be put on the asparagus bed or the rose bushes. He could make a lye leech, knew that it was lucky to set hens on 13 eggs, realized that hens' eggs hatched in 3 weeks and ducks in 4. He knew when the berries ripened, where the crows nested, and could find the bee trees by watching the flight of the bees after they had gotten their fill on the basswood blossoms. He knew all the birds that sang in the branches, could tell what birds migrated and what not, was acquainted with the flowers and weeds and fungi, knew where the rabbits burrowed, could pick the milkweed that would cure warts, and tell the points of the compass by examining the bark of the trees. He was on familiar terms with all the ragamuffins in the village, and regarded the man who kept the livery stable as the wisest person in New England, and the stage driver as the wittiest. Lyman Beecher was a graduate of Yale, and Henry Ward would have been had he been able to pass the preparatory examinations. But he couldn't, and finally he was bundled off to Amherst, very much as we now send boys to a business college when they get plucked at the high school. But it matters little. Give the boys time. Some of them ripen slowly, and others there be who know more at 16 than they will ever know again, like street gamins, with a wit of debaucheries, rapparees at 10, and rotten at the core. Delay adolescence, wrote Dr. Charcot to an anxious mother. Delay adolescence, and you bank energy until it is needed. If your boy is stupid at 14, thank God. Dullness is a fulcrum, and your son is getting ready to put a lever under the world. At Amherst, Henry Ward stood well at the foot of his class. He read everything except what was in the curriculum, and never allowed his studies to interfere with his college course. He reveled in the debating societies, and was always ready to thrash out any subject in wordy warfare against all comers. His temper was splendid, his good nature sublime. If an opponent got the best of him, he enjoyed it as much as the audience. He could wait his turn. The man who can laugh at himself, and who is not anxious to have the last word, is right in the suburbs of greatness. However, the Beechers all had a deal of positivism in their characters. Thomas K. Beecher of Elmira in 1856 declared he would not shave until John C. Fremont was elected president. It is needless to add that he wore whiskers the rest of his life. When Henry Ward was 19, his father received a call to become president of Lane Theological Seminary at Cincinnati, and Henry Ward accompanied him as assistant. The stalwart old father had now come to recognize the worth of his son, and for the first time parental authority was waived, and they were companions. They were very much alike, exuberant health, energy, plus faith and hope to spare. And Henry Ward now saw that there was a gentle, tender, and yearning side to his father's nature, into which the world caught only glimpses. Lyman Beecher was not free. He was bound by a hagiograph riveted upon his soul, and so, to a degree, his whole nature was cramped and tortured in his struggles between the natural man and the spiritual. The son was taught by antithesis, and inwardly vowed he would be free. The one word that looms large in the life of Beecher is liberty. Henry Ward Beecher died aged 74, having preached since he was 23. During that time he was pastor of 3 churches, 2 years at Lawrenceburg, Indiana, 6 years at Indianapolis, and 43 years in Brooklyn. It was in 1837 that he became pastor of the Congregational Church at Lawrenceburg. This town was then a rival of Cincinnati. It had 6 churches, several more than were absolutely needed. The Baptists were strong, the Presbyterians were strenuous, the Episcopalians were exclusive, while the Congregationalists were at ebb tide through the rascality of a preacher who had recently decamped and thrown a blanket of disgrace over the whole denomination for 10 miles up the creek. Thus were things when Henry Ward Beecher assumed his first charge. The membership of the church was made up of 19 women and 1 man. The new pastor was sexton as well as preacher. He swept out, rang the bell, lighted the candles, and locked up after service. Beecher remained in Lawrenceburg 2 years. The membership had increased to 106 men and 70 women. I suppose it will not be denied as an actual fact that women bolster the steeples so that they stay on the churches. From the time women held the rope and let St. Paul down in safety from the wall in a basket, women have maintained the faith. But Beecher was a man's preacher from first to last. He was a bold, manly man making his appeal to men. 2 years at Lawrenceburg, and he moved to Indianapolis, the capital of the state, his reputation having been carried thither by the member from Posey County, who incautiously boasted that his district has the most powerful preacher of any town on the Ohio River. At Indianapolis, Beecher was a success at once. He entered into the affairs of the people with an ease and a good nature that won the hearts of this semi-pioneer population. His lectures to young men, delivered Sunday evenings to packed houses, still have a sale. This bringing religion down from the lofty heights of theology and making it a matter of everyday life was eminently Beecheresque, and the reason it was a success was because it fitted the needs of the people. Beecher expressed what the people were thinking. Mankind clings to the creed. We will not burn our bridges. We want the religion of our mothers, yet we crave the simple common sense we can comprehend as well as a superstition we can't. Beecher's task was to rationalize orthodoxy so as to make it palatable to thinking minds. "I can't ride 2 horses at one time," once said Robert Ingersoll to Beecher, "but possibly I'll be able to, yet for tomorrow I'm going to hear you preach." Then it was that Beecher offered to write Ingersoll's epitaph, which he proceeded to do by scribbling 2 words on the back of an envelope, thus, Robert Burns. But these men understood and had a thorough respect for each other. Once at a mass meeting at Cooper Union, Beecher introduced Ingersoll as the first, foremost, and most gifted of all living orators. And Ingersoll, not to be outdone, referred in his speech to Beecher as the one orthodox clergyman in the world who has eliminated hell from his creed and put the devil out of church and still stands in his pulpit. 6 years at Indianapolis put Beecher in command of his armament, and Brooklyn, seeking a man of power, called him thither. His first sermon in Plymouth Church outlined his course, and the principles then laid down he was to preach for 50 years. The love of God, the life of Christ, not as a sacrifice but as an example, our elder brother, and liberty to think, to express, to act, to become. It would have been worth going miles to see this man as he appeared at Plymouth Church those first years of his ministry. Such a specimen of mental, spiritual, and physical manhood nature produces only once in a century. Imagine a man of 35, when manhood has not yet left youth behind, height 5 feet 10, weight 180, a body like that of a Greek god, and a mind poised, sure, serene, with a fund of good nature that could not be overdrawn. A face cleanly shaven, a wealth of blonde hair falling to his broad shoulders, eyes of infinite blue, eyes like the eyes of Christ when he gazed upon the penitent thief on the cross, or eyes that flash fire, changing their color with the mood of the man. A radiant, happy man, the cheeriest, sunniest nature that ever dwelt in human body, with a sympathy that went out to everybody and everything. Children, animals, the old, the feeble, the fallen, a man too big to be jealous, too noble to quibble, a man so manly that he would accept guilt rather than impute it to another. If he had been possessed of less love, he would have been a stronger man. The generous nature lies open and unprotected. Through its guilelessness it allows concrete rascality to come close enough to strike it. One reason why Beecher had so many enemies was because he bestowed so many benefits, said Rufus Choate. Talmage did not discover himself until he was 46. Beecher was Beecher at 35. He was as great then as he ever was. It was too much to ask that he should evolve into something more. Nature has to distribute her gifts. Had Beecher grown after his 35th year as he grew from 25 to 35, he would have been a colossus that would have disturbed the equilibrium of the thinking world and created revolution instead of evolution. The opposition towards great men is right and natural. It is part of nature's plan to hold the balance true, lest ye become as gods. I traveled with Major James B. Pond one lecture season, and during that time heard only 2 themes discussed, John Brown and Henry Ward Beecher. These were his gods. Pond fought with John Brown in Kansas, shoulder to shoulder, and it was only through an accident that he was not with Brown at Harper's Ferry, in which case his soul would have gone marching on with that of old John Brown. From 1860 to 1866, Pond belonged to the Army and was stationed in western Missouri, where there was no commissariat, where they took no prisoners, and where men like Jesse James lived, who never knew the war was over. Pond had so many notches cut on the butt of his pistol that he had ceased to count them. He was big, brusque, quibbling, insulting, dictatorial, painstaking, considerate, and kind. He was the most exasperating and lovable man I ever knew. He left a trail of enemies wherever he traveled, and the irony of fate is shown in that he was allowed to die peacefully in his bed. I cut my relationship with him because I did not care to be pained by seeing his form dangling from the crossbeam of a telegraph pole. When I lectured at Washington, a policeman appeared at the box office and demanded the amusement license fee of $5. "Your authority," roared Pond, and the policeman not being able to explain, Pond kicked him down the stairway and kept his club as a souvenir. We got out on the midnight train before warrants could be served. He would often push me into the first carriage when we arrived at a town, and sometimes the driver would say, "This is a private carriage," or "This rig is engaged," and Pond would reply, "What's that to me? Drive us to the hotel. You evidently don't know whom you are talking to." And so imperious was his manner that his orders were usually obeyed. Arriving at the hotel, he would hand out double fare. It was his rule to pay too much or too little. Yet, as a manager, he was perfection. He knew the trains to a minute, and always knew, too, what to do if we missed the first train, or if the train was late. At the hall, he saw that every detail was provided for. If the place was too hot or too cold, somebody got thoroughly damned. If the ventilation was bad and he could not get the windows open, he would break them out. If you questioned his balance sheet, he would the next day flash up an expense account that looked like a plumber's bill and give you 50 cents as your share of the spoils. At hotels, he always got a room with 2 beds if possible. I was his prisoner. He was despotically kind. He regulated my hours of sleep, my meals, my exercise. He would throw intruding visitors downstairs as average men shoot chickens or scare cats. He was a bundle of profanity and unrest until after the lecture. Then we would go to our room, and he would talk like a windmill. He would crawl into his bed and I into mine, and then he would continue telling Beecher stories half the night, comparing me with Beecher to my great disadvantage. A dozen times I have heard him tell how Beecher would say, "Pond, never consult me about plans or explain details. If you do, our friendship ceases." Beecher was glad to leave every detail of travel to Pond, and Pond delighted in assuming solo charge. Beecher never audited an account. He just took what Pond gave him and said nothing. In this, Beecher was very wise. He managed Pond, and Pond never knew it. Pond had a pride in paying Beecher as much as possible and found gratification in giving the money to Beecher instead of keeping it. He was immensely proud of his charge and grew to have an idolatrous regard for Beecher. Pond's brusque ways amused Beecher, and the Osawatomie experience made him a sort of hero in Beecher's eyes. Beecher took Pond at his true value, regarded his wrath as a child's tantrum, and let him do most of the talking as well as the business. And Beecher's great welling heart touched a side of Pond's nature that few knew existed at all, a side that he masked with harshness. For, in spite of his perversity, Pond had his virtues. He was simple as a child and so ingenuous that deception with him was impossible. He could not tell a lie, so you would not know it. He served Beecher with a dog-like loyalty and an honesty beyond suspicion. They were associated 14 years, traveled together over 300,000 miles, and Pond paid to Beecher $240,000. End of section 18. Section 19 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Eminent Orators. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Little Journeys to the Homes of Eminent Orators by Elbert Hubbard. Henry Ward Beecher, Part 2. Beecher and Tilton became acquainted about the year 1860. Beecher was at that time 47 years old. Tilton was 25. The influence of the older man over the younger was very marked. Tilton became one of the most zealous workers in Plymouth Church. He attended every service, took part in the Wednesday evening prayer meeting, helped take up the collection, and was a constant recruiting force. Tilton was a reporter and later an editorial writer on different New York and Brooklyn dailies. Beecher's Sunday sermon supplied Tilton the cue for his next day's leader. And be it said, to his honor, he usually gave due credit, and in various ways helped the cause of Plymouth Church by booming the reputation of its pastor. Tilton was possessed of a deal of intellectual nervous force. His mind was receptive, active, versatile. His all-around newspaper experience had given him an education, and he could express himself acceptably on any theme. He wrote children's stories, threw off poetry in idle hours, penned essays, skimmed the surface of philosophy, and dived occasionally into theology. But his theology and his philosophy were strictly the goods put out by Beecher, distilled through the Tilton cosmos. He occasionally made addresses at social gatherings and evolved into an orator whose reputation extended to Staten Island. Beecher's big, boyish heart went out to this bright and intelligent young man. They were much in each other's company. People said they looked alike, although one was tall and slender and the other was inclined to be stout. Beecher wore his hair long, and now Tilton wore his long, too. Beecher affected a wide-brimmed slouch hat. Tilton wore one of similar style, with brim a trifle wider. Beecher wore a large blue cloak. Tilton wrapped himself round with a cloak one shade more ultramarine than Beecher's. Tilton's wife was very much like Tilton. Both were intellectual, nervous, artistic. They were so much alike that they give us hint of what a hell this world would be if all mankind were made in one mold. But there was this difference between them. Mrs. Tilton was proud, while Tilton was vain. They were only civil toward each other because they had vowed they would be. They did not throw crockery because to do so would have been bad form. Beecher was a great joker, hilarious, laughing, and both witty and humorous. I was going to say he was wise, but that isn't the word. Tilton lacked wit. He never bubbled except as a matter of duty. Both Mr. and Mrs. Tilton greatly enjoyed the society of Beecher, for, besides being a great intellectual force, his presence was an antiseptic against jaundice and introspection. And Beecher loved them both because they loved him and because he loved everybody. They supplied him a foil for his wit, a receptacle for his overflow of spirit, a flint on which to strike his steel. Mrs. Tilton admired Beecher a little more than her husband did. She was a woman. Tilton was glad that his wife liked Beecher. It brought Beecher to his house, and if Beecher admired Tilton's wife, why, was not this a proof that Tilton and Beecher were alike? I guess so. Mrs. Tilton was musical, artistic, keen of brain, emotional, with all a fine-fibered woman's longings, hopes, and ideals. So matters went drifting on the tide, and the years went by as the years will. Mrs. Tilton became a semi-invalid, the kind that doctors now treat with hypophosphites, beef iron, and wine, cod liver oil, and massage by the right attendant. They call it congenital anemia, a scarcity of the red corpuscle. Some doctors there be who do not yet know that the emotions control the secretions, and a perfect circulation is a matter of mind. Anyway, what can the poor Galenite do in a case like this? His pills are powerless, his potions inane. Tilton knew that his wife loved Beecher, and he also fully realized that in this she was only carrying out a little of the doctrine of freedom that he taught, and that he claimed for himself. For a time, Tilton was beautifully magnanimous. Occasionally, Mrs. Tilton had spells of complete prostration, when she thought she was going to die. At such times her husband would send for Beecher to come and administer extreme unction. Instead of dying, the woman would get well. After one such attack, Tilton taunted his wife with her quick recovery. It was a taunt that pulled tight on the corners of his mouth. It was lacking in playfulness. Beecher was present at the bedside of the propped-up invalid. They turned on Tilton, did these two, and flayed him with their agile wit and ready tongues. Tilton protested they were wrong. He was not jealous. The idea! But that afternoon he had his hair cut and he discarded the slouch hat for one with a stiff brim. It took 6 months for his hair to grow to a length sufficient to indicate genius. Beecher's great heart was wrung and stung by the tangle of events in which he finally found himself plunged. That his love for Mrs. Tilton was great there is no doubt, and for the wife with whom he had lived for over a score of years he had a profound pity and regard. She had not grown with him. Had she remained in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, and married a well-to-do grocer, all for her would have been well. Beecher belonged to the world, and this his wife never knew. She thought she owned him. To interest her and to make her shine before the world, certain literary productions were put out with her name as author, on request of Robert Bonner, but all this was a pathetic attempt by her husband to conceal the truth of her mediocrity. She spied upon him, watched his mail, turned his pockets, and did all the things no wife should do, lest perchance she be punished by finding her suspicions true. Wives and husbands must live by faith. The wife who is miserable until she makes her husband confess all is never happy afterwards. Beecher could not pour out his soul to his wife. He had to watch her mood and dole out to her platitudes she could digest. Never with her did he reach abandon. But the wife strove to do her duty. She was a good housekeeper, economical and industrious, and her very virtues proved a source of exasperation to her husband. He could not hate her. It was Mrs. Beecher herself who first discovered the relationship existing between her husband and Mrs. Tilton. She accused her husband, and he made no denial. He offered her liberty. But this she did not want. Beecher promised to break with Mrs. Tilton. They parted forever in sweet sorrow. And the next week they met again. The greater the man before the public, the more he outpours himself, the more his need for mothering in the quiet of his home. All things are equalized, and with the strength of the sublime spiritual nature goes the weakness of a child. Beecher was an undeveloped boy to the day of his death. Beecher at one time had a great desire to stand square before the world. Major Pond, on Beecher's request, went to Mrs. Beecher and begged her to sue for a divorce. At the same time, Tilton was asked to secure a divorce from his wife. When all parties were free, Beecher would marry Mrs. Tilton and face the world an honest man, nothing to hide, right out under the clear blue sky blown upon by the free winds of heaven. This was his heart's desire. But all negotiations failed. Mrs. Beecher would not give up her husband, and Tilton was too intent on revenge and cash to even consider the matter. Then came the crash. Tilton sued Beecher for $100,000 damages for alienating his wife's affection. It took 5 months to try the case. The best legal talent in the land was engaged. The jury disagreed, and the case was not tried again. Had Mrs. Beecher applied for a divorce on statutory grounds, no court would have denied her prayer. In actions for divorce, guilt does not have to be proved, it is assumed. But when one man sues another for money damages, the rulings are drawn finer and matters must be proved. That is where Tilton failed in his lawsuit. At the trial, Beecher perjured himself like a gentleman to protect Mrs. Tilton. Mrs. Tilton waived the truth for Beecher's benefit, and Mrs. Beecher swore black was white because she did not want to lose her husband. Such a precious trinity of prevaricators is very seldom seen in a courtroom, a place where liars much do congregate. Judge and jury knew they lied and respected them the more, for down in the hearts of all men is a feeling that the love affairs of a man and a woman are sacred themes, and a bulwark of lies to protect the holy of holies is ever justifiable. Tilton was the one person who told the truth, and he was universally execrated for it. Love does not leave a person without reason, and there is something in the thought of money as payment to a man for a woman's love that is against nature. Tilton lost the woman's love, and he would balm his lacerated heart with lucre? Money? God help us, a man should earn money. We sometimes hear of men who subsist on women's shame, but what shall we say of a man who would turn parasite and live in luxury on a woman's love? And this woman by him now spurned and scorned. The faults and frailties of men and women caught in the swirl of circumstances are not without excuse, but the cold plottings to punish them and the desire to thrive by their faults are hideous. The worst about a double life is not its immorality, it is that the relationship makes a man a liar. The universe is not planned for duplicity. All the energy we have is needed in our business, and he who starts out on the path of untruth finds himself treading upon brambles and nettles which close behind him and make return impossible. The further he goes, the worse the jungle of poison oak and ivy, which at last circles round him in strangling embrace. He who escapes the clutch of a life of falsehood is as one in a million. Victor Hugo has pictured the situation when he tells of the man whose feet are caught in the bed of birdlime. He attempts to jump out, but only sinks deeper. He flounders, calls for help, and puts forth all his strength. He is up to his knees, to his hips, his waist, his neck, and at last only hands are seen reaching up in mute appeal to heaven. But the heavens are as brass, and soon where there was once a man is only the dumb indifference of nature. The only safe course is the open road of truth. Lies once begun pile up, and lies require lies to bolster them. Mrs. Tilton had made a written confession to her husband, but this she repudiated in court, declaring it was given in terrorem. Now she had only words of praise and vindication for Beecher. Mrs. Beecher sat by her husband's side all through the long trial. For a man to leave the woman with whom he has lived a lifetime and who is the mother of his children is out of the question. What if she does lack intellect and spirituality? He has endured her, aye. He has even been happy with her at times. The relationship has been endurable. 'Twere imbecility and death for both to break it. Beecher and his wife would stand together. Mrs. Tilton's lips had been sanctified by love and were sealed, though her heart did break. The jury stood 9 for Beecher and 3 against. Major Pond, the astute, construed this into a vindication. Beecher was not guilty. The first lecture after the trial was given at Alexandria Bay. Pond had sold out for $500. Beecher said it was a rank robbery. No one would be there. The lecture was to be in the Grove at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. In the forenoon, boats were seen coming from east and west and north, excursion boats laden with pilgrims, sailboats, rowboats, skiffs, and even birch-bark canoes bearing red men. The people came also in carts and wagons and on horseback. An audience of 5,000 confronted the lecturer. The man who had planned the affair had banked on his knowledge of humanity. The people wanted to see and hear the individual who had been whipped naked at the cart's tail, and who still lived to face the world smilingly, bravely, undauntedly. Major Pond was paid the $500 as agreed. The enterprise had netted its manager over $1,000. He was a rich man anyway. Things had turned out as he had prophesied, and in the exuberance of his success, he that night handed Mr. Beecher a check for $250, saying, "This is for you with my love. It is outside of any arrangement made with Major Pond." After they had retired to their rooms, Beecher handed the check to Pond and said, as his blue eyes filled with tears, "Major, you know what to do with this." And Major Pond said, "Yes." Tilton went to Europe, leaving his family behind, but Major Pond made it his business to see that Mrs. Tilton wanted for nothing that money could buy. Beecher never saw Mrs. Tilton to converse with her again. She outlived him a dozen years. On her deathbed, she confessed to her sister that her denials as to her relations with Beecher were untrue. "He loved me," she said. "He loved me, and I would have been less than woman had I not loved him. This love will be my passport to paradise. God understands." And so she died. Tilton was by nature an unsuccessful man. He was proudly aristocratic, lordly, dignified, jealous, mentally wiggling, and spiritually jiggling. His career was like that of a racehorse, which makes a record faster than he can ever attain again, and thus is forever barred from all slow-paced competitions. Tilton aspired to be a novelist, an essayist, a poet, an orator. His performances in each of these lines, unfortunately, were not bad enough to damn him, and his work done in fair weather was so much better than he could do in foul that he was caught by the undertow. And as for doing what Adirondack Murray did, get right down to hardpan and wash dishes in a dishpan, he couldn't do it. Like an Indian, he would starve before he would work, and he came near it, gaining a garret living, teaching languages, and doing hack literary work in Paris, where he went to escape the accumulation of contempt that came his way just after the great Beecher trial. Before this, Tilton started out to star the country as a lecturer. He evidently thought he could climb to popularity over the wreck of Henry Ward Beecher. Even had he wrecked Beecher completely, it is very likely he would have gone down in the swirl and become literary flotsam and jetsam just the same. Tilton had failed to down his man, and men who are failures do not draw on the lecture platform. The auditor has failure enough at home, God knows, and what he wants when he lays down good money for a lecture ticket is to annex himself to a success. Tilton's lecture was called The Problem of Life, a title which had the advantage of allowing the speaker to say anything he wished to say on any subject and still not violate the unities. I heard Tilton give this lecture twice, and it was given from start to finish in exactly the same way. It contained much learning, had flights of eloquence, bursts of bathos, puffs of pathos, but not a smile in the whole hour and a half. It was faultily faultless, icily regular, splendidly null, dead perfection, no more. It was so perfect that some people thought it great. The man was an actor and had what is called platform presence. He would walk on the stage carrying his big blue cloak over his arm, his slouch hat in his hand, for he clung to these Beecher properties to the last, even claiming that Beecher was encroaching on his preserve and wearing them. He would bow as stiffly and solemnly as a new-made judge. Then he would toss the cloak on a convenient sofa, place the big hat on top of it, and come down to the footlights, deliberately removing his yellow kid gloves. There was no introduction. He was the whole show, and brooked no competition. He would begin talking as he removed the gloves. He would get one glove off, and hold it in the other hand, seemingly lost in his speech. From time to time he would emphasize his remarks by beating the palm of his gloved hand with the loose glove. By the time the lecture was half over, both gloves would be lying on the table. Unlike the performance of Sir Edward Arnold, who, during his readings, always wore one white kid glove and carried its mate in the gloved hand from beginning to end. Theodore Tilton's lectures were consummate art, done by a handsome, graceful, and cultured man in a red necktie, but they did not carry enough caloric to make them go. They seemed to lack vibrations. Art without a message is for the people who love art for art's sake, and God does not care much for these, otherwise he would not have made so few of them. Lyman Abbott sums up his estimate of the worth of his lifelong friend and literary associate, Henry Ward Beecher, in the following words, quote, "It was in the pulpit that Beecher was seen at his best. His mastery of the English tongue, his dramatic power, his instinctive art of impersonation, which had become a second nature, his vivid imagination, his breadth of intellectual view, the catholicity of his sympathies, his passionate enthusiasm, which made for the moment his immediate theme, seemed to him the one theme of transcendent importance, his quaint humor alternating with genuine pathos, and above all his simple and singularly unaffected devotional nature, made him as a preacher without a peer in his own time and country. His favorite theme was love. Love to man was to him the fulfillment of all law. Love of God was the essence of all Christianity. Retaining to the day of his death the forms and phrases of the New England theology in which he had been reared, he poured into them a new meaning and gave to them a new significance. He probably did more than any other man in America to lead the Puritan churches from a faith which regarded God as a moral governor, the Bible as a book of laws, and religion as obedience, to a conscience, to a faith which regards God as a father, the Bible as a book of counsels, and religion as a life of liberty and love." End quote. As a sample of Beecher's eloquence, this extract from his sermon on the death of Lincoln reveals his quality as well perhaps as anything he ever said. Quote, "The joy of the nation came upon us suddenly with such a surge as no words can describe. Men laughed, embraced one another, sang and prayed, and many could only weep for gladness. In one short hour joy had no pulse. The sorrow was so terrible that it stunned sensibility. The first feeling was the least, and men wanted to get strength to feel. Other griefs belong always to someone in chief, but this belonged to all. Men walked for hours as though a corpse lay in their houses. The city forgot to roar. Never did so many hearts in so brief a time touch two such boundless feelings. It was the uttermost of joy and the uttermost of sorrow, noon and midnight without a space between. We should not mourn, however, because the departure of the president was so sudden. When one is prepared to die, the suddenness of death is a blessing. They that are taken awake and watching as the bridegroom dressed for the wedding, and not those who die in pain and stupor, are blessed. Neither should we mourn the manner of his death. The soldier prays that he may die by the shot of the enemy in the hour of victory, and it was meet that he should be joined in a common experience in death with the brave men to whom he had been joined in all his sympathy in life. This blow was but the expiring rebellion. Epitomized in this foul act we find the whole nature and disposition of slavery. It is fit that its expiring blow should be such as to take away from men the last forbearance, the last pity, and fire the soul with invincible determination that the breeding system of such mischiefs and monsters shall be forever and utterly destroyed. We needed not that he should put on paper that he believed in slavery, who, with treason, with murder, with cruelty infernal, hovered round that majestic man to destroy his life. He was himself the lifelong sting with which slavery struck at liberty, and he carried the poison that belonged to slavery. And as long as this nation lasts, it will never be forgotten that we have had one martyr president. Never, never while time lasts, while heaven lasts, while hell rocks and groans, will it be forgotten that slavery by its minions slew him, and in slaying him made manifest its whole nature and tendency. This blow was aimed at the life of the government. Some murderers there have been that admitted shades of palliation, but not such a one as this, without provocation, without reason, without temptation, sprung from the fury of a heart cankered to all that is pure and just. The blow has failed of its object. The government stands more solid today than any pyramid of Egypt. Men love liberty and hate slavery today more than ever before. How naturally, how easily the government passed into the hands of the new president, and I avow my belief that he will be found a man true to every instinct of liberty, true to the whole trust that is imposed in him, vigilant of the Constitution, careful of the laws, wise for liberty, in that he himself for his life long has known what it is to suffer from the stings of slavery and to prize liberty from the bitter experience of his own life. Even he that sleeps has by this event been clothed with new influence. His simple and weighty words will be gathered like those of Washington and quoted by those who, were he alive, would refuse to listen. Men will receive a new access to patriotism. I swear you on the altar of his memory to be more faithful to that country for which he perished. We will, as we follow his hearse, swear a new hatred to that slavery against which he warred, and which, in vanquishing him, has made him a martyr and conqueror. I swear you by the memory of this martyr to hate slavery with an unabateable hatred, and to pursue it. We will admire the firmness of this man in justice, his inflexible conscience for the right, his gentleness and moderation of spirit, which not all the hate of party could turn to bitterness. And I swear you to follow his justice, his moderation, his mercy. How can I speak to that twilight million to whom his name was as the name of an angel of God, and whom God sent before them to lead them out of the house of bondage? O thou shepherd of Israel, thou that didst comfort thy people of old, to thy care we commit these helpless and long wronged and grieved. And now the martyr is moving in triumphal march, mightier than one alive. The nation rises up at every stage of his coming, cities and states are his pallbearers, and the cannon beat the hours in solemn progression. Dead, 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 he yet speaketh. Is Washington dead? Is Hampton dead? Is David? 4 years ago, O Illinois, we took from your midst an untried man from among the people. Behold, we return him to you a mighty conqueror, not thine any more, but the nation's, not ours, but the world's. Give him place, O ye prairies. In the midst of this great continent shall rest a sacred treasure to myriads, who shall pilgrim to that shrine to kindle anew their zeal and patriotism. Ye winds that move over mighty spaces of the west, chant his requiem. Ye people, behold the martyr whose blood, as so many articulate words, pleads for fidelity, for law, for liberty. End quote. End of section 19. Section 20 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Eminent Orators. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Little Journeys to the Homes of Eminent Orators by Elbert Hubbard. Wendell Phillips, Part 1. What worldwide benefactors these imprudent men are! How prudently most men creep into nameless graves, while now and then one or two forget themselves into immortality. Speech on Lovejoy. May the good Lord ever keep me from wishing to say the last word, and also from assigning ranks or awarding prizes to great men gone. However, it is a joy to get acquainted with a noble, splendid personality, and then introduce him to you, or at least draw the arras, so you can see him as he lived and worked or nobly failed. And if you and I understand this man, it is because we are much akin to him. The only relationship, after all, is the spiritual relationship. Your brother after the flesh may not be your brother at all. You may live in different worlds and call to each other in strange tongues across wide seas of misunderstandings. Who is my mother and who are my brethren? As you understand a man just in that degree are you related to him. There is a great joy in discovering kinship, for in that moment you discover yourself, and life consists in getting acquainted with yourself. We see ourselves mirrored in the soul of another. That is what love is, or pretty nearly so. If you like what I write, it is because I express for you the things you already know. We are akin, our heads are in the same stratum. We are breathing the same atmosphere. To the degree that you comprehend the character of Wendell Phillips, you are akin to him. I once thought great men were all 10 feet high, but since I have met a few, both in astral form and in the flesh, I have found out differently. What kind of man was Wendell Phillips? Very much like you and me, blessed, very much like you and me. I think well of great people, I think well of myself, and I think well of you. We are all God's children, all parts of the whole, akin to divinity. Phillips never thought he was doing much, never took any great pride in past performances. When what you have done in the past looks large to you, you have not done much today. His hopes were so high that there crept into his life a tinge of disappointment. Some have called it a bitterness. But that is not the word, just a touch of sadness because he was unable to do more. This was a matter of temperament, perhaps, but it reveals the humanity as well as the divinity of the man. There is nothing worse than self-complacency. Smugosity is sin. Phillips was not supremely great. If he were, how could we comprehend him? And now if you will open those folding doors, there, that will do. Thank you. When was he born? I'll tell you, it was in his 25th year, about 3 in the afternoon, by the clock, October 21st, 1835. The day was Indian summer, warm and balmy. He sat there reading in the window of his office on Court Street, Boston, a spick-span new law office, with 4 shelves of law books bound in sheep, a green-covered table in the center, 3 armchairs, and on the wall a steel engraving of Washington crossing the Delaware. He was a handsome fellow, was this Wendell Phillips. It would have been worth your while just to run up the stairs and put your head in the door to look at him. Can I do anything for you? He would have asked. No, we just wanted to see you, that's all, we would have replied. He sat there at the window, his long legs crossed, a copy of Coke on Little Tin in his hands. His dress was what it should be, that of a gentleman. His face cleanly shaven, hair long, cut square and falling to his black stock. He was the only son of Boston's first mayor, both to the manor and to the manor born, rich in his own right, proud, handsome, strong, gentle, refined, educated, a Christian gentleman, heir to the best that Boston had to give, a graduate of the Boston Latin School, of Harvard College, of the Harvard Law School, living with his widowed mother in a mansion on Beacon Hill overlooking Boston's 43 acres of common. Can you imagine anything more complete in way of endowment than all this? Did destiny ever do more for mortal man? There he sat waiting for clients. About this time he made the acquaintance of a cockeyed, pulchritudinous youth, Ben Butler by name, who was errand boy in a nearby office. It was a strange friendship, peppered by much crossfire whenever they met in public, to endure loyal for a lifetime. Clients are sure to come to the man who is not too anxious about them, sure to come to a man like Phillips, a youth clothed with the graces of a Greek, waiting on the threshold of manhood's morning. Here is his career: a successful lawyer and leader in society, a member of the legislature, a United States senator, and then if he cares for it, well, well, well. But in the meantime there he sits, not with his feet in the window or on a chair. He is a gentleman, I said, a Boston gentleman, the flower of a gracile ancestry. In the lazy, hazy air is the hum of autumn birds and beetles. The hectic beauty of the dying year is over all. The hum seems to grow. It becomes a subdued roar. You have sat behind the scenes, waiting for the curtain to rise. 1,000 people are there just out of your sight. 500 of them are talking. It is one high-keyed humming roar. The roar of a mob is keyed lower. It is guttural and approaches a growl. It seems to come in waves, a brazen roar rising and falling, but a roar full of menace, hate, deaf to reason, dead to appeal. You have heard the roar of the mob in Julius Caesar, and stay, once I heard the genuine article. It was in '84, goodness gracious, I am surely getting old. It was in a town out west. I saw nothing but a pushing, crowding mass of men, and all I heard was that deep, guttural roar of the beast. I could not make out what it was all about until I saw a man climbing a telegraph pole. He was carrying a rope in one hand. As he climbed higher, the roar subsided. The climber reached the arms that formed the cross. He swung the rope over the crossbeam and paid it out until the end was clutched by the uplifted hands of those below. The roar arose again like an angry sea, and I saw the figure of a human being leap 20 feet into the air and swing and swirl at the end of the rope. The roar ceased. The lawyer laid down the brand-new book, bound in sheep, and leaned out of the window. Men were running down the thoroughfare, some hatless, and at Washington Street could be seen a black mass of human beings who had forsaken their reason and merged their personality into a mob. The young lawyer arose, put on his hat, locked his office, followed down the street. His tall and muscular form pushed its way through the mass. Theodore Lyman, the mayor, was standing on a barrel importuning the crowd to disperse. His voice was lost in the roar of the mob. From down a stairway came a procession of women, 30 or so, walking by twos, very pale but calm. The crowd gradually opened out on a stern order from some unknown person. The young lawyer threw himself against those who blocked the way. The women passed on, and the crowd closed in as water closes over a pebble dropped into the river. The disappearance of the women seemed to heighten the confusion. There were stones thrown, sounds of breaking glass, a crash on the stairway, and down the narrow passage, with yells of triumph, came a crowd of men, half dragging a prisoner, a rope around his waist, his arms pinioned. The man's face was white, his clothing disheveled and torn. His resistance was passive. No word of entreaty or explanation escaped his lips. A sudden jerk on the rope from the 100 hands that clutched it threw the man off his feet. He fell headlong, his face struck the stones of the pavement, and he was dragged for 20 yards. The crowd grabbed at him and lifted him to his feet. Blood dripped from his face, his hat was gone, his coat, vest, and shirt were in shreds. The man spoke no word. "That's him, Garrison, the damned abolitionist." The words arose over the din and surge of the mob. "Kill him! Hang him!" Phillips saw the colonel of his militia regiment, and seizing him by the arm, said, "Order out the men to put down this riot." "Fool," said the colonel, "don't you see our men are in this crowd?" "Then order them into columns, and we will protect this man." "I never give orders unless I know they will be obeyed. Besides, this man Garrison is a rioter himself. He opposes the government." "But do we uphold mob law here in Boston?" "Don't blame me. I haven't anything to do with this business. I tell you, if this man Garrison had minded his own affairs, this scene would never have occurred." "And those women?" "Oh, they are members of the Anti-Slavery Society. It was their holding the meeting that made the trouble. The children followed them, hooting them through the streets." "Children?" "Yes, you know children repeat what they hear at home. They echo the thoughts of their elders. The children hooted them, then someone threw a stone through a window. A crowd gathered, and here you are." The colonel shook himself loose from the lawyer and followed the mob. The mayor's counsel prevailed. "Give the prisoner to me. I will see that he is punished." And so he was dragged to the city hall and there locked up. The crowds lingered, then thinned out. The shouts grew less, and soon the police were able to rout the loiterers. The young lawyer went back to his law office, but not to study. The law looked different to him now. The whole legal aspect of things had changed in an hour. It was a pivotal point. He had heard much of the majesty of the law, and here he had seen the entire machinery of justice brushed aside. Law. It is the thing we make with our hands and then fall down and worship. Men want to do things, so they do them, and afterward they legalize them, just as we believe things first and later hunt for reasons. Or we illegalize the thing we do not want others to do. Boston, standing for law and order, will not even allow a few women to meet and discuss an economic proposition. Abolition is a fool idea, but we must have free speech. That is what our Constitution is built upon. Law is supposed to protect free speech, even to voicing wrong ideas. Surely a man has a legal right to a wrong opinion. A mob in Boston to put down free speech. This young lawyer was not an abolitionist, not he, but he was an American descended from the Puritans with ancestors who fought in the War of the Revolution. He believed in fair play. His cheeks burned with shame. Seen from Mount Olympus, how small and pitiful must seem the antics of earth. All these churches and little sects, our laws, our arguments, our courts of justice, our elections, our wars. Viewed across the years, the abolition movement seems a small thing. It is so thoroughly dead, so far removed from our present interests. We hear a Virginian praise John Brown, listen to Henry Watterson as he says, "The South never had a better friend than Lincoln," or brave General Gordon as he declares, "We now know that slavery was a gigantic mistake, and that Emerson was right when he said, 'One end of the slave's chain is always riveted to the wrist of the master.'" We can scarcely comprehend that 50 years ago the trinity of money, fashion, and religion combined in the hot endeavor to make human slavery a perpetuity, that the man of the North who hinted at resisting the return of a runaway slave was in danger of financial ruin, social ostracism, and open rebuke from the pulpit. The ears of Boston were so stuffed with South Carolina cotton that they could not hear the cry of the oppressed. Commerce was fettered by self-interest, and law ever finds precedents and sanctions for what commerce most desires. And as for the pulpit, it is like the law in that scriptural warrant is always forthcoming for what the pew wishes to do. Slavery, theoretically, might be an error, but in America it was a commercial, political, social, and religious necessity, and any man who said otherwise was an enemy of the state. William Lloyd Garrison said otherwise. But who was William Lloyd Garrison? Only an ignorant and fanatical freethinker from the country town of Newburyport, Massachusetts. He had started 4 or 5 newspapers, and all had failed because he would not keep his pen quiet on the subject of slavery. New England must have cotton, and cotton could not be produced without slaves. Garrison was a fool. All good Christians refused to read his vile sheet, and businessmen declined to advertise with him or to subscribe to his paper. However, he continued to print things telling what he thought of slavery. In 1831, he was issuing a periodical called The Liberator. I saw a partial file of The Liberator recently at the Boston Public Library. They say it is very precious, and a custodian stood by and tenderly turned the leaves for me. I was not allowed even to touch it, and when I was through looking at the tattered pages, they locked it up in a fireproof safe. The sheets of different issues were of various sizes, and the paper was of several grades and quality, showing that stock was scarce and that there was no system in the office. There surely was not much of a subscription list, and we hear of garrisons going around and asking for contributions. But interviews were what he really wished, as much as subscribers. He let the preachers defend the peculiar institution. To print a man's fool remarks is the most cruel way of indicting him. Among those Garrison called on was Dr. Lyman Beecher, then thundering against Unitarianism. Garrison got various clergymen to commit themselves in favor of slavery, and he quoted them verbatim, whereas on this subject the clergy of the North wished to remain silent. Very silent. Dr. Beecher was wary. All he would say was, "I have too many irons in the fire now." "You had better take them all out and put this one in," said the seedy editor. But Dr. Beecher made full amends later. He supplied a son and a daughter to the abolition movement, and this caused Carlos Martin to say, "The old man's loins were wiser than his head." Garrison had gotten himself thoroughly disliked in Boston. The mayor once replied to a letter inquiring about him, "He is a nobody and lives in a rat hole." But Garrison managed to print his paper, rather irregularly, to be sure, but he printed it. From one room he moved into two, and a straggling company calling themselves the Anti-Slavery Society used his office for a meeting place. And now, behold the office mobbed, the type pitched into the street, the society driven out, and the fanatical editor, bruised and battered, safely lodged in jail, writing editorials with a calm resolution and a will that never faltered. And Wendell Phillips? He was pacing the streets, wondering whether it was worth while to be respectable and prosperous in a city where violence took the place of law when logic failed. To him, Garrison had won. Garrison had not been answered, only beaten, bullied, abused, and thrust behind prison bars. Wendell Phillips's cheeks burned with shame. Garrison was held a prisoner for several days. The mayor would have punished the man, Pilate-like, to appease public opinion, but there was no law to cover the case. No illegal offense had been committed. Garrison demanded a trial, but the officials said that they had locked him up merely to protect him and that he was a base ingrate. Official Boston now looked at the whole matter as a good thing to forget. The prisoner's cell door was left open in the hope that he would escape, just as, later, George Francis Train enjoyed the distinction of being the only man who was literally kicked down the stone steps of the Tombs. Garrison was thrust out of limbo with a warning and a hint that Boston town was a good place for him to emigrate from. But Garrison neither ran away nor went into hiding. He calmly began a canvass to collect money to refit his printing office. Boston had treated him well. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. He would stay. Men who fatten on difficulties are hard to subdue. Phillips met Garrison shortly after his release, quite by chance, at the house of Henry G. Chapman. Garrison was 6 years older than Phillips, tall, angular, intellectual, and lacked humor. He also lacked culture. Phillips looked at him and smiled grimly. But in the Chapman household was still another person more or less interesting, a Miss Anne Terry Green. She was an orphan and an heiress, a ward of Chapman's. Young Phillips had never before met Miss Green, but she had seen him. She was one of the women who had come down the stairs from the Liberator office when the mob collected. She had seen the tall form of Phillips and had noticed that he used his elbows to good advantage in opening up the gangway. It was a little like a cane rush. Your campus practice served you in good stead, said the lady, and smiled. And Phillips listened, perplexed that a young woman like this, frail intellectual of good family, should mix up in fanatical schemes for liberating black men. He could not understand it. But you were there. You helped get us out of the difficulty. And if worse had come to worse, I might have appealed to you personally for protection. And the young lawyer stammered, "I should have been only too happy," or something like that. The lady had the best of the logic, and a thin attempt to pity her on account of the unfortunate occurrence went off by the right oblique and was lost in space. These abolitionists were a queer lot. Not long after that meeting at the Chapmans, the young lawyer had legal business at Greenfield that must be looked after. Now, Greenfield is 100 miles from Boston, but then it was the same distance from Tidewater that Omaha is now. That is to say, a 2 days' journey. The day was set. The stage left every morning at 9 o'clock from the Bowdoin Tavern in Bowdoin Square. A young fellow by the name of Charles Sumner was going with Phillips, but at the last moment was detained by other business. That his chum could not go was a disappointment to Phillips. He paced the stone-paved courtway of the tavern with clouded brow. All around was the bustle of travel, and tearful friends bidding folks good-bye in the romantic rush of stagecoach land. The ease and luxury of travel have robbed it of its poetry. Ruskin was right. But it didn't look romantic to Wendell Phillips just then. His chum had failed him. The weather was cold. 2 days of hard jolting lay ahead, and... Ah, yes, it is Miss Green, and Miss Grew, and Mr. Alvord. To Greenfield? Why, how fortunate! Obliging strangers exchanged seats so that our friends could be together. Passengers found their places on top or inside. Bundles and bandboxes were packed away. Harness chains rattled, and a long whip sang through the air, and the driver, holding a big bunch of lines in one hand, swung the 6 horses with careless grace out of Bowdoin Square and turned the leaders' heads towards Cambridge. The post horn tooted merrily, dogs barked, and stable boys raised a goodbye cheer. Out past Harvard Square they went, through Arlington and storied Lexington, on to Concord, through Fitchburg to Greenfield. It doesn't take long to tell it, but that was a wonderful trip for Phillips. The greatest and most important journey of his life, he said 40 years later. Miss Grew lived in Greenfield and had been down to visit Miss Green. Mr. Alvord was engaged to Miss Grew and wanted to accompany her home, but he couldn't exactly, unless Miss Green went along. So Miss Green obliged them. The girls knew the day Phillips was going and hastened their plans a trifle so as to take the same stage. At least that is what Charles Sumner said. They didn't tell Phillips because a planned excursion on the part of these young folks wouldn't have been just right. Beacon Hill would not have approved. But when they had bought their seats and met at the stage yard, why, that was a different matter. Besides, Mr. Alvord and Miss Grew were engaged, and Miss Green was a cousin of Miss Grew. There! Let me here say that I am quite aware that long after Miss Grew became Mrs. Alvord, she wrote a most charming little book about Anne Terry Green, in which she defends the woman against any suspicion that she plotted and planned to snare the heart of Wendell Phillips on the road to Greenfield. The defense was done in love, but was unnecessary. Anne Terry Green needs no vindication. As for her snaring the heart of Wendell Phillips, I rest solidly on this. She did. Whether Miss Green coolly planned that trip to Greenfield, I cannot say, but I hope so. And anyway, it was destiny. It had to be. This man and this woman were made for each other. They were elected before the foundations of earth were laid. The first few hours out, they were very gay. Later, they fell into serious conversation. The subject was abolition. Miss Green knew the theme in all of its ramifications and parts, its history, its difficulties, its dangers, its ultimate hopes. Phillips soon saw that all of his tame objections had been made before and answered. Gradually, the horror of human bondage swept over him, and against this came the magnificence of freedom and of giving freedom. By evening, it came to him that all of the immortal names in history were those of men who had fought liberty's battle. That evening, as they sat around the crackling fire at the Fitchburg Tavern, they did not talk. A point had been reached where words were superfluous. The silence sufficed. At daybreak the next morning, the journey was continued. There was conversation, but voices were keyed lower. When the stage mounted a steep hill, they got out and walked. Melancholy had taken the place of mirth. Both felt that a great and mysterious change had come over their spirits. Their thought was fused. Miss Green had suffered social obloquy on account of her attitude on the question of slavery. To share this obloquy seemed now the one thing desirable to Phillips. It is a great joy to share disgrace with the right person. The woman had intellect, education, self-reliance, and passion. There was an understanding between them, and yet no word of tenderness had been spoken. An avowal formulated in words is a cheap thing, and a spoken proposal goes with a cheap passion. The love that makes the silence eloquent and fills the heart with a melody too sacred to voice is the true token. O God, we thank Thee for the thoughts and feelings that are beyond speech. End of section 20. Section 21 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Eminent Orators. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Little Journeys to the Homes of Eminent Orators by Elbert Hubbard. Wendell Phillips, Part 2. When it became known that Wendell Phillips, the most promising of Boston's young sons, had turned abolitionist, Beacon Hill rent its clothes and put ashes on its head. On the question of slavery, the first families of the North stood with the first families of the South. The rights of property were involved, as well as the question of caste. Let one of the scions of Wall Street avow himself an anarchist, and the outcry of horror would not be greater than it was when young Phillips openly declared himself an abolitionist. His immediate family were in tears. The relatives said they were disgraced. Cousins cut him dead on the street, and his name was stricken from the list of invited guests. The social column editors ignored him, and worst of all, his clients fled. The biographers are too intensely partisan to believe, literally, and when one says he left a large and lucrative practice that he might devote himself, etc., we'd better reach for the Syracuse product. Wendell Phillips never had a large and lucrative practice, and if he had, he would not have left it. His little law business was the kind that all fledglings get, the kind that big lawyers do not want, and so they pass it over to the boys. Doctors are always turning pauper patients over to the youngsters, and so in successful law firms there is more or less of this semi-charitable work to do. Business houses also have fag-end work that they give to beginners, as kind folks give bones to Fido. Wendell Phillips's law work was exactly of this contingent kind. Big business and big fees only go to big men and tried. Law is a business, and lawyers who succeed are businessmen. Social distinction has its pull in all professions and all arts, and the man who can afford to affront society and hope to succeed is as one in a million. Lawyers and businessmen were not so troubled about Wendell Phillips's inward beliefs as they were in the fact that he was a fool. He had flung away his chances of getting on in the world. They ceased to send him business. He had no work, no callers. Folks he used to know were now strangely nearsighted. Phillips didn't quit the practice of law any more than he withdrew from society. Both law and society quit him. And then he made a virtue of necessity and boldly resigned his commission as a lawyer. He would not longer be bound to protect the Constitution that upheld the right of a slave owner to capture his property in Massachusetts. He and Anne talked this over at length. They had little else to do. They excommunicated society, and Wendell Phillips became an outlaw in the same way that the James boys became outlaws, through accident and not through choice. Social disgrace is never sought. An obloquy is not a thing to covet. These things may come, and usually they mean a smother blanket to all worldly success. But Anne and Wendell had their love, and each had a bank account, and then they had a pride that proved a prophylactic against the clutch of oblivion. On October 12, 1837, the outlaws, Anne and Wendell, were married. It was a quiet wedding. Guests were not invited because it was not pleasant to court cynical regrets, and kinsmen were noticeable by their absence. Proscription had its advantages. For one thing, it binds human hearts like hoops of steel. Yet it was not necessary here, for there was no waning of the honeymoon during the 40-odd years of married life. But scarcely had the petals fallen from the orange blossoms before an event occurred that marked another milestone in the career of Phillips. At St. Louis, the Reverend E.P. Lovejoy, a Presbyterian clergyman, had been mobbed and his printing office sacked because he had expressed himself on the subject of slavery. Lovejoy then moved up to Alton, Illinois, on the other side of the river, on free soil, and here he sought to re-establish his newspaper. But he was to benefit the cause in another way than by printing editorials. The place was attacked, the presses broken into fragments, the type flung into the Mississippi River, and Lovejoy was killed. A tremor of horror ran through the North. It was not the question of slavery. No, it was the right of free speech. A meeting was called at Faneuil Hall to consider the matter and pass fitting resolutions. There was something beautifully ironical in Boston interesting herself concerning the doings of a mob 1,000 miles away, especially when Boston herself had done about the same thing only 2 years before. Boston preferred to forget, but somebody would not let her. Just who called the meeting no one seemed to know. The word abolition was not used on the placards. Free speech was the shibboleth. The hall had been leased, and the assembly was to occur in the forenoon. The principal actors evidently anticipated serious trouble if the meeting was at night. The authorities sought to discourage the gathering, but this only advertised it. At the hour set, the place, the cradle of liberty, was packed. The crowd was made up of 3 classes, the abolitionists, and they were in the minority, the mob who hotly opposed them, and the curious and indifferent people who wanted to see the fireworks. Many women were in the audience, and a dozen clergymen on the platform. This gave respectability to the assemblage. The meeting opened tamely enough with a trite talk by a Unitarian clergyman, and followed along until the resolutions were read. Then there were cries of "Table them!" The matter was of no importance. A portly figure was seen making its way to the platform. It was the Honorable James T. Austin, Attorney General of the state. He was stout, florid, ready of tongue, a practical stump speaker, and withal a good deal of a popular favorite. The crowd cheered him. He caught them from the start. His intent was to explode the whole thing in a laugh, or else end it in a row. He didn't care which. He pooh-poohed the whole affair, and referred to the slaves as a menagerie of lions, tigers, hyenas, a jackass or two, and a host of monkeys, which the fool abolitionists were trying to turn loose. He regretted the death of Lovejoy, but his taking off should be a warning to all good people. They should be law-abiding and mind their own business. He moved that the resolutions be tabled. The applause that followed showed that if a vote were then taken, the Attorney General's motion would have prevailed. "Answer him, Wendell, answer him," whispered Anne excitedly, and before the Attorney General had bowed himself from the platform, Wendell Phillips had sprung upon the stage and stood facing the audience. There were cries of "Vote! Vote!" The mobocrats wanted to cut the matter short. Still others shouted, "Fair play! Let us hear the boy!" The young man stood there, calm, composed, handsome in the strength of youth. He waited until the audience came to him, and then he spoke in that dulcet voice, deliberate, measured, faultless, every sentence spaced. The charm of his speech caught the curiosity of the crowd. People did not know whether he was going to sustain the Attorney General or assail him. From compliments and generalities he moved off into bitter sarcasm. He riddled the cheap wit of his opponent, tore his logic to tatters, and held the pitiful rags of reason up before the audience. There were cries of "Treason! Put him out!" Phillips simply smiled and waited for the frenzy to subside. The speaker who has aroused his hearers into a tumult of either dissent or approbation is one, and Phillips did both. He spoke for 30 minutes and finished in a whirlwind of applause. The Attorney General had disappeared, and those of his followers who remained were strangely silent. The resolutions were passed in a shout of acclamation. The fame of Wendell Phillips as an orator was made. Father Taylor once said, "If Emerson goes to hell, he will start emigration in that direction." And from the day of that first Faneuil Hall speech, Wendell Phillips gradually caused abolitionism in New England to become respectable. Phillips was 27 years old when he gave that first great speech, and for just 27 years he continued to speak on the subject of slavery. He was an agitator. He was a man who divided men. He supplied courage to the weak, arguments to the many, and sent a chill of hate and fear through the hearts of the enemy. And just here is a good place to say that your radical, your fire-eater, agitator, and revolutionary who dips his pen in aquafortis and punctuates with blood is almost without exception met socially a very gentle, modest, and suave individual. William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Horace Greeley, Frederick Douglass, George William Curtis, and even John Brown were all men with low musical voices and modest ways, men who would not tread on an insect nor harm a toad. When the fight had been won, the Emancipation Proclamation issued, there were still other fights ahead. The habit of Phillips's life had become fixed. He and Anne lived in that plain little home on Exeter Street, and to this home of love he constantly turned for rest and inspiration. At the close of the war he found his fortune much impaired, and he looked to the Lyceum stage, the one thing for which he was so eminently fitted. It was about the year 1880 that a callow interviewer asked him who his closest associates were. The answer was, "My colleagues are hackmen and hotel clerks, and I also know every conductor, brakeman, and engineer on every railroad in America. My home is in the caboose, and my business is establishing trains." I heard Wendell Phillips speak but once. I was about 12 years of age, and my father and I had ridden 10 miles across the wind-swept prairie in the face of a winter storm. It was midnight when we reached home, but I could not sleep until I had told my mother all about it. I remember the hall was packed, and there were many gaslights, and on the stage were a dozen men, all very great, my father said. One man arose and spoke. He lifted his hands, raised his voice, stamped his foot, and I thought he surely was a very great man. He was just introducing the real speaker. Then the real speaker walked slowly down to the front of the stage and stood very still, and everybody was awful quiet. No one coughed, nor shuffled his feet, nor whispered. I never knew 1,000 folks could be so still. I could hear my heart beat. I leaned over to listen, and I wondered what his first words would be, for I had promised to remember them for my mother. And the words were these: "My dear friends, we have met here tonight to talk about the lost arts." That is just what he said. I'll not deceive you, and it wasn't a speech at all. He just talked to us. We were his dear friends, he said so. And a man with a gentle, quiet voice like that would not call us his friends if he wasn't our friend. He had found out some wonderful things, and he had just come to tell us about them, about how thousands of years ago men worked in gold and silver and ivory, how they dug canals, sailed strange seas, built wonderful palaces, carved statues, and wrote books on the skins of animals. He just stood there and told us about these things. He stood still, with one hand behind him or resting on his hip, or at his side, and the other hand motioning a little. That was all. We expected every minute he would burst out and make a speech, but he didn't. He just talked. There was a big yellow pitcher and a tumbler on the table, but he didn't drink once because, you see, he didn't work very hard. He just talked. He talked for 2 hours. I know it was 2 hours because we left home at 6 o'clock, got to the hall at 8, and reached home at midnight. We came home as fast as we went, and if it took us 2 hours to come home and he began at 8, he must have been talking for 2 hours. I didn't go to sleep, didn't nod once. We hoped he would make a speech before he got through, but he didn't. He just talked, and I understood it all. Father held my hand. We laughed a little in places, at others we wanted to cry, but didn't. But most of the time we just listened. We were going to applaud, but forgot it. He called us his dear friends. I have heard thousands of speeches since that winter night in Illinois. Very few indeed can, I recall, and beyond the general theme, that speech by Wendell Phillips has gone from my memory. But I remember the presence and attitude and voice of the man as though it were but yesterday. The calm courage, deliberation, beauty, and strength of the speaker, his knowledge, his gentleness, his friendliness. I had heard many sermons, and some had terrified me. This time I had expected to be thrilled too, and so I sat very close to my father and felt for his hand. And here it was all just quiet joy. I understood it all. I was pleased with myself, and being pleased with myself, I was pleased with the speaker. He was the biggest and best man I had ever seen, the first real man. It is no small thing to be a man. In 1853, Emerson said the reason Phillips was the best public speaker in America was because he had spoken every day for 14 years. This observation didn't apply to Phillips at all, but Emerson used Phillips to hammer home a great general truth, which was that practice makes perfect. Emerson, like all the rest of us, had certain pet theories which he was constantly bolstering by analogy and example. He had Phillips in mind when he said that the best drill for an orator was a course of mobs. But the cold fact remains that Phillips never made a better speech, even after 14 years' daily practice, than that reply to Attorney General Austin at Faneuil Hall. He gave himself, and it was himself, full-armed and at his best. All the conditions were exactly right. There was hot opposition, and there also was love and encouragement. His opponent, with brag, bluster, pomposity, cheap wit, and insincerity, served him as a magnificent foil. Never again were wind and tide so in his favor. It is opportunity that brings out the great man, but he only is great who prepares for the opportunity, who knows it will come, and who seizes upon it when it arrives. In this speech, Wendell Phillips reveals himself at his best. It has the same ring of combined courage, culture, and sincerity that he showed to the last. Clear thinking and clear speaking marked the man. Taine says the style is the man. The Phillips style was all in that first speech, and here is a sample. To draw the conduct of our ancestors into a precedent for mobs, for a right to resist laws we ourselves have enacted, is an insult to their memory. The difference between the excitement of those days and our own, which this gentleman in kindness to the latter has overlooked, is simply this. The men of that day went for the right as secured by laws. They were the people rising to sustain the laws and the constitution of the province. The rioters of our day go for their own wills, rights, or wrong. Sir, when I heard the gentleman lay down principles which placed the murderers of Alton side by side with Otis and Hancock, with Quincy and Adams, I thought those pictured lips, pointing to the portraits in the hall, would have broken into voice to rebuke the recreant American, the slanderer of the dead. The gentleman said he should sink into insignificance if he condescended to gainsay the principles of these resolutions, for the sentiments he has uttered on soil consecrated by the prayers of Puritans and the blood of patriots, the earth should have yawned and swallowed him up. Allusion has been made to what lawyers understand very well, the conflict of laws. We are told that nothing but the Mississippi River runs between St. Louis and Alton, and the conflict of laws somehow or other gives the citizens of the former a right to find fault with a defender of the press for publishing his opinions so near the limits. Will the gentleman venture that argument before lawyers? How the laws of the two states could be said to come into conflict in such circumstances, I question whether any lawyer in this audience can explain or understand. No matter whether the line that divides one sovereign state from another be an imaginary one or ocean-wide, the moment you cross it, the state you leave is blotted out of existence, so far as you are concerned. The Tsar might as well claim to control the deliberations of Faneuil Hall as the laws of Missouri demand reverence, or the shadow of obedience, from an inhabitant of Illinois. Sir, as I understand this affair, it was not an individual protecting his property. It was not one body of armed men assaulting other and making the streets of a peaceful city run blood with their contentions. It did not bring back the scenes in some old Italian cities where family met family and faction met faction and mutually trampled the laws underfoot. No, the men in that house were regularly enrolled under the sanction of the mayor. There being no militia in Alton, about 70 men were enrolled with the approbation of the mayor. These relieved each other every other night. About 36 men were in arms on the night of the 6th when the press was landed. The next evening it was not thought necessary to summon more than half that number. Among these was Lovejoy. It was, therefore, you perceive, sir, the police of the city resisting rioters, civil government breasting itself to the shock of lawless men. Here is no question about the right of self-defense. It is, in fact, simply this. Has the civil magistrate a right to put down a riot? Some persons seem to imagine that anarchy existed at Alton from the commencement of these disputes. Not at all. No one of us, as an eyewitness and a comrade of Lovejoy, has taken up arms during these disturbances but at the command of the mayor. Anarchy did not settle down on that devoted city till Lovejoy breathed his last. Till then the law, represented in his person, sustained itself against its foes. When he fell, civil authority was trampled underfoot. He had planted himself on his constitutional rights, appealed to the laws, claimed the protection of the civil authority, taken refuge under the broad shield of the Constitution. When through that he was pierced and fell, he fell but one sufferer in a common catastrophe. He took refuge under the banner of liberty amid its folds, and when he fell, its glorious stars and stripes, the emblem of free constitutions, around which cluster so many heart-stirring memories, were blotted out in the martyr's blood. If, sir, I had adopted what are called peace principles, I might lament the circumstances of this case. But all of you who believe, as I do, in the right and duty of magistrates to execute the laws, join with me and brand as base hypocrisy the conduct of those who assemble year after year on the 4th of July to fight over battles of the Revolution, and yet damn with faint praise or load with obloquy the memory of this man who shed his blood in defense of life, liberty, and the freedom of the press. Imprudent to defend the freedom of the press. Why? Because the defense was unsuccessful? Does success gild crime into patriotism and want of it change heroic self-devotion to imprudence? Was Hampden imprudent when he drew the sword and threw away the scabbard? Yet he, judged by that single hour, was unsuccessful. After a short exile, the race he hated sat again upon the throne. Imagine yourself present when the first news of Bunker Hill battle reached a New England town. The tale would have run thus. The patriots are routed, the redcoats victorious, Warren lies dead upon the field. With what scorn would that Tory have been received who should have charged Warren with imprudence? Who should have said that, bred as a physician, he was out of place in the battle, and died as the fool dieth? Great applause. How would the intimation have been received that Warren and his associates should have waited a better time? But if success be indeed the only criterion of prudence, respite finum, wait till the end. Presumptuous to assert the freedom of the press on American ground, is the assertion of such freedom before the age? So much before the age as to leave one no right to make it because it displeases the community? Who invents this libel on his country? It is this very thing which entitles Lovejoy to greater praise. The disputed right which provoked the Revolution, taxation without representation, is far beneath that for which he died. Here there was a strong and general expression of disapprobation. One word, gentlemen. As much as thought is better than money, so much is the cause in which Lovejoy died nobler than a mere question of taxes. James Otis thundered in this hall when the king did but touch his pocket. Imagine, if you can, his indignant eloquence had England offered to put a gag upon his lips. Great applause. The question that stirred the Revolution touched our civil interests. This concerns us not only as citizens, but as immortal beings. Wrapped up in its fate, saved or lost with it, are not only the voice of the statesman, but the instructions of the pulpit and the progress of our faith. Is the clergy marvelously out of place, where free speech is battled for, liberty of speech on national sins? Does the gentleman remember that freedom to preach was first gained, dragging in its train freedom to print? I thank the clergy here present, as I reverence their predecessors, who did not so far forget their country in their immediate profession as to deem it duty to separate themselves from the struggle of 76, the Mayhews and the Coopers, who remembered they were citizens before they were clergymen. I am glad, sir, to see this crowded hall. It is good for us to be here. When liberty is in danger, Faneuil Hall has the right, it is her duty, to strike the keynote of these United States. I am glad for one reason that remarks such as those to which I have alluded have been uttered here. The passage of these resolutions, in spite of this opposition, led by the Attorney General of the Commonwealth, will show more clearly, more decisively, the deep indignation with which Boston regards this outrage. End of section 21. End of Little Journeys to the Homes of Eminent Orators by Elbert Hubbard.